Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and to another layout design video. Before I get into this design, I need to share a little bit of background with my viewers. The client for this layout design already had a layout that he had commissioned to be professionally built for him by another layout builder. The layout was based very closely on an old layout design which many people will have seen before in a plan book. I'll get back to that later. And it was installed in his basement, although the original builder never managed to get it to run reliably. And then what finally killed that railroad was the need to move to a different home. But by the time the client was ready to have the railroad reassembled in his new basement, the company that had built the original layout was no longer in business. So the client contacted me and asked if I would be able to reassemble it for him. But when I travelled to the client's home, it soon became evident that the layout was really not worth reassembling. I have some photographs taken that day which I'll show you while I talk. I'm not going to show the original layout design because that's probably going to infringe copyrights, but if you want to have a look at it, just bring up a new window on your browser and type Central Midland Plan 29 into the search bar, and that will bring up several links showing the original design. It was originally designed by none other than John Armstrong, and anyone who's been in the hobby for any length of time will know that name. He was originally hired by Atlas to design this plan for their book, and it was published as number 29. The main feature of it is a terminal yard on a double track Y. It's very much a spaghetti bowl, as were most layouts of that era, and in order to fit it into the space, it required 18-inch radius curves, number 4 turnouts, and grades in excess of 3%. But as you'll probably realise from looking at these photographs, the original layout really wasn't worth reassembling. There was no way anyone was ever going to get it to work reliably. So the fact that this layout building company is no longer in business is probably a good thing. Anyway, going back to the client's basement plan, the small squares are 12 inches, so we can see that the client has somewhat more space available than would be needed for the original plan. So he commissioned me to improve on that. So this is actually the second time that I've been hired to improve on a plan originally drawn by John Armstrong. So if we take a look at the site plan, we can see that the main rectangular space is about 13 feet by 18. Stairs come down along here. There are various doors, exits, closets, and an alcove in this corner. This light grey curved area is a wet bar, and although not shown on this drawing, there is an additional pair of closet doors here where the mouse is now. Now this is the orientation that I first drew the plan, and it turns out that it's rotated 180 degrees from what it should be. So partway through the design you'll see that I turn it around to the correct orientation. So just giving you a heads up on that now. Anyway, here is the basis of the plan. We have a double track Y at the right side of the plan, giving access to a small terminal yard. Now even before I'd left the customer's site, after we decided that it wasn't worth reassembling the existing layout, we had some discussion as to how we should best use the slightly larger area available. Initially I suggested simplifying the double track Y, but the client told me that was the main attraction to the plan for him. He really wanted to leave that untouched. But he did like the suggestion of modifying the plan so that instead of being a double track main, we would split it into two single track mains, one of which would drop down to a lower level staging yard and the other one would rise up above the main level to another switching town along the back wall over here. Now the client at this point only had 4-axle diesels, so the sharp curves were not necessarily a problem for him, although he was interested in the possibility of being able to run some 6-axle diesels later if he found somebody he liked. So one of the things he wanted to do was open out the curve radius slightly. If you recall, I mentioned the original plan had 18-inch radius curves and number 4 turnouts. In this one we've drawn all the curves at 30-inch radius, and this is the first drawing I sent back to the client asking for feedback on whether it would be feasible to take the upper main line through the corner of this closet. And he wrote back to me and said, no, that can't be done. This is poured concrete, and realistically we weren't going to be able to get through the wall. So unfortunately that means this turnback curve cannot be located where I would have liked it, but you have to move it in front of the closet instead. Here is a later plan that I drew. It's not the very next one. I think I've skipped at least one, maybe two others, but it shows this lobe curving in front of the closet, missing it altogether, creating a small additional lobe in this area. But there was still plenty of clearance, 36 inches between the side of the stairs and the edge of the benchwork. I put that number in, figuring since the stairs were only 36 inches wide, there was certainly no need to go any wider. On the other hand, I am being sure to leave 48 inches in front of the bar, so that there's room for people to sit there on stools without blocking the area completely. And by this stage, we've already cut down the minimum radius on the upper loop. Although we still have 30 inches on the lower loop, all the main curves on the upper loop, here, and also in this corner, are cut down to 24 inches radius. And ultimately, we ended up dropping the radius on the lower loop from 30 inches down to 27. The problem being that we were just a little bit short of space on the width, so it didn't quite fit with 30-inch radius. You can see in this plan that the aisle along the back is rather too narrow for comfort, hence the reason for shaving 3 inches off the curves. Anyway, on this plan you can see the upper loop running around in its entirety, and you can see the lower loop disappearing at this point to lower staging, and at this point to the lower level. And in this plan I'm also showing the possibility of building a future addition along the back edge of the railroad. Not only would it provide a lot of additional switching interest, but having a narrow piece of benchwork along here would also tend to prevent people from backing up and knocking the TV off the wall. Here is the lower level plan, showing how the lower loop can spiral down, a single lap helix at this end and kind of a balloon loop at this end, allowing it to drop low enough to get adequate clearance for giving good access to the staging yard. Here is another drawing where I'm filling in potential track layouts and also being the first of the plans that I've drawn in the correct orientation. And yes, I know this plan is still a spaghetti bowl. That was always going to be the case. Any attempt to fix that, and it would no longer have been a rendition of the original plan, which the customer had referred to several times as his lifelong dream, having a railroad based on that design. So that's why we're not trying to fix the spaghetti bowl, we're just fixing some of the other problems with it. So here is the lower level in the same orientation. I think the only change to the lower level track is that I have flipped the direction of this loop to make access to it easier. Now next I started working out the various elevations, and that drew attention to a potential problem with the design as originally drawn. If you notice, the branch line comes off at pretty much the highest elevation on the plan, and the sound bar under the TV on this wall had only 45 inches clearance underneath it, so clearly the track along here cannot be more than 42 inches elevation. We can gain another inch to the high point, but then working our way down from there, keeping everything as high as possible, the layout is still rather low. So take a look at this blue line angled across this end to a junction at point X, and let me show the lower level. Here are the low level elevations based on the previous plan with the high level branch line. But if instead we move the branch line to the lower level, putting the junction at point X where the mouse is now, introducing a grade crossing at this point, that has the equivalent elevation of only being 33 inches, which is 11 inches lower than the high level branch line. Thus, by eliminating the high level branch and building the low level branch instead, we can raise the entire railroad by 11 inches, which makes a huge difference. And as a side advantage, since the branch line is now at the lowest visible elevation, it becomes an ideal candidate for a harbour branch. And harbours have a great deal to offer the model railroader. Not only are the prototypes often very cramped, but they bring in a whole range of opportunities afforded by the waterfront setting. So here is a later version of the plan. The first thing to note are the improved elevations resulting from the low level branch instead of the high level one. And also I've managed to fix some space problems that I had with the aisles not really being wide enough. I mentioned before that we were very short of space across this end. I've managed to get several more inches of aisle space by twisting the entire plan by 2 degrees and introducing a curved fascia along this back aisle. Most of the aisle is 30 inches wide, just dropping to 24 inches just for the last few feet, where it's really not a big problem because operators are never going to need to pass in that area. And here is the lower level finished with the revised elevations drawn in, and you may notice I've modified this crossing to use a standard commercial 90-degree crossing, which is of course readily available from several different sources. And as I've made a note here, allowing for 4 inches of bench work under the upper level, there is an 11-inch opening for staging yard access. The ruling grade on the lower circuit ended up being 2.5%, which was a little more than I was aiming for, but the client's only ever going to be running fairly short trains, so this is never going to be a problem. The reason for steepening the grade, if we go back to the previous drawing, was that it allowed the Y to be much more level. We still have to gain 1 inch in the Y, but until we steepen the ruling grade, the whole Y had to be much steeper, which we both felt was undesirable. So anyway, here is the final design with all the structures and scenery suggestions drawn in. I have used backdrops sparingly in this design. You see there is one running around this corner and around the lower corner as well. The area between the two, I have disguised the back edge with a tree line because this alcove has several high-level shelves that the client wants to use to display some of his railroad memorabilia. And we felt there was also the possibility of building cabinets in these 2 alcoves along the south wall to display some more of it. I'm not too concerned about whether the harbour terminal is in its final form yet, because there is no intention of building this at the outset. As I mentioned earlier, this is just a possible future addition, but it's always best to work out possible future additions in at least some degree of detail at the outset, just to ensure that they're going to be worthwhile. Now, in an attempt to try to make the railroad look as large as possible from the normal operating position, which is going to be of course right in the centre of the room here, I've envisaged 2 fairly high scenic ridges, one along the main axis of the railroad and another one in this small lobe on the north side. That would ensure that from the usual operating position, both the north and south extremities of the railroad are hidden from view, thus meaning that this miniature world will stretch around 3 sides of the owner and appear to go on forever. The client already has 2 truss bridges, which were built by the original builder, and in fact they actually look pretty decent. They are based on the Central Valley trusses, which always make up into nice bridges, and I've reused those on the plan. One in this scene right where the viewer comes in, the first scene to be seen, and one in the middle of the peninsula in its original location. All the other bridges would have to be built anew. We have a short but tall curved trestle, a much longer low trestle across the middle of the town, and several other bridges. Now, I mentioned much earlier that the whole object of redesigning this layout was to improve the original design and get rid of some of the problems. Instead of using entirely number 4 turnouts as on the original railroad, all the mainline turnouts are 7s or 8s, and there are a few number 6 turnouts in the yard ladder here and on industrial spurs at the upper town, and I've also included a couple of number 5s in industrial areas as well. It may look as though this junction is a lot sharper than a number 7, and the crossing is a 14-degree angle, but the turnouts are both number 7s. By spreading the track centre lines and trimming this turnout just after the frog, it's possible to insert an additional curve making up the difference in the angle, without causing any alignment problems. And the other 2 crossings need to be custom-built curved crossings. That's the only way it was going to fit in the width available. You've probably also noticed that these 2 double junctions use curved turnouts as well, again saving quite a lot of space, not only because of the extra degrees of curvature in the turnout, but because they actually form the easement, so we don't have to incorporate another foot or so at each end for that. I always draw my mainline easements on HO scale plans at 16 inches long. A lot of people that I've seen use shorter ones, but I think the longer the better, and to me that just seems like a good compromise. Apart from these industrial spurs in this area, the only curves as sharp as 24 inches are the two main ones on the upper loop and the one on the branch line to the harbour. On the lower circuit, the only visible 27-inch radius curves are this one here and the two curved legs of the Y, everything else being 30 inches or better. I've already mentioned that the ruling grade is significantly reduced, and also the maximum train length is about twice what it was on the original plan. Now, most of the industries are kept fairly generic, since the client doesn't really know what he wants to include. I added a lot more water features in. The last one to be added was the one in this corner, as in order to make this track look right, the scenery had to be fairly low at this point, so it needed a valley, and I felt that inserting a small lake would be the best way of making that work. Note how the lake is kind of a kidney shaped. This ensures that the far end of it cannot be seen from any normal viewing location, and therefore it hides the fact that there's no inlet to it. I particularly like this northern lobe. I think it would be the scenic highlight of the railroad, and certainly something that would look great as the first scene that visitors see, and therefore creating a good first impression of the railroad, providing of course it's done well. Before closing, let me show you a clean version of the plan. Here's one with all the annotations gone. Feel free to pause that if you want a longer look at it. And now here is another view showing the full extent of the client's basement and giving you a better idea of how it fits. Anyway, that is all for this design. Hope you've enjoyed the presentation and found it useful or interesting or both, and I hope to see you back for next week's video. In the meantime, thanks for watching and bye for now.